Welcome to How to Become a Production SQL Database Administrator. My name is Raphael. In the previous several videos, we looked at what is a transactional log file, and that is a file that records all changes and modifications to the database. We've looked at why you should back up the transactional log file, and that's primarily to clear the transactional log and control its size. And then we've also taken advantage of the dbcc log info command to look inside the transactional log. And I've also given you a demonstration of what happens when a transactional log file gets out of control. And that's primarily because we've got the recovery model, which we spoke about in full, but we're not taking any transactional log backups. And we've indicated many times that taking a full database backup does not truncate the log or clear it. Only a transactional log file backup does that. So one of the other features, or a couple other things that we need to know about the transactional log that's critical, is the auto growth feature that's set by default based on the model database. And then I'm going to be discussing in the next video most likely what's called virtual log files. And virtual log files basically is anatomy of a transactional log file. And I'll demonstrate what that is in a second. But let's now concentrate on what is auto growth feature. Well, let me demonstrate that here before we get into what it is. If you open any database, for example, the admin beta, right-click, go to Properties, go to Files, you'll see this auto growth and max size functionality. As you can see, by default, the auto growth increment for the data file is to increase it by 1 megabyte. And then the transactional log file here is to increase the auto growth by 10%. And both are unlimited, meaning it'll continually grow by this megabyte and by this percentage until it consumes the entire space. So that's when we're talking about auto growth. So what is its function in terms of database management? So let's look at that again in a little more detail. So an auto growth event is a part of a SQL that expands the database file when it runs out of space. If there's a transaction, such as many inserts that are going on that require more log space than is available, then the transactional log file of that database will need to adjust to the new space needed by increasing the log file. And this is what I mean by here. So if we go back to the properties here, you'll see that if I do multiple inserts or multiple modifications to the database, and the log file is at this present time only 1 megabyte, if it requires more than space than allocated, here as in this example 1, then it will increase by 10% each time the transactional log goes beyond the initial size. And this is something we want to avoid, as this causes fragmentation. So I'll be demonstrating that in a second also. So that's what auto growth is. So why do we want to avoid it? This is obviously a performance issue that we want to manage proactively. And this is also what's called a blocking operation. And what I mean by that is as follows. The transaction, or in this case the insert that I'm going to demonstrate, there's a transaction that initiated the log growth, meaning what caused the expansion of the transactional log to grow as a result of inserts, will be held until more space is allocated. And this can cause obviously a performance issue. Another thing that can cause is physical fragmentation, because we can have too many virtual log files expanding, and I'll be demonstrating that in the next example. So one of the key things to do is proactively manage the size and initially manage the size of the auto growth properties. And we're going to be demonstrating that in a second. So the way we do that obviously is we pre-size both the log and the data files. We do that obviously manually, so the auto log growth is not initiated. And we should only rely on the auto growth feature as a last resort. And this is in case some unexpected transactions occurs that we didn't account for, and then only auto growth should occur. So don't rely on auto growth. And again, I think will become a little clearer as we demonstrate it. So let's go into SQL environment and start looking at it. So the first thing I'm going to do, obviously, if you look at the database here, I'm going to make sure I've dropped the databases that I don't want. In this case, I'm going to be using 2 databases. One is called Auto, and one is called the Auto2. So the first thing I'm going to do, as you can see, is I'm going to create a database with default setting based on the model database configuration. If you left click here, right click on the model, go to Properties, and go to Files, you'll see that the initial size of the data file is 3. You'll see the initial file of the transaction log is 1 megabyte. And you'll see the auto growth and max size is 1 megabyte growth rate for data files and growth rate of 10% of log files. So anytime you create a database based on the model, this is the automatic settings that we get. And this is what we do not want in a production. So this is what's going to demonstrate it. So the first thing I'm going to do, as you'll notice here, I'm going to create a database called auto. And remember, this is the initial size of 3 megabytes. And this is the initial size of 1 megabyte. And then the auto growth, which is this capability here, again, for the data files, as we just saw physically, it's going to grow by 1 megabyte. And then the transactional log file is going to grow by 10%. So let's look at it first. I'm going to highlight and execute. And now we've got a database. So if you go to your databases and refresh, go to database and refresh, you'll see that we have an auto database created. And if we right click, go to Properties, Files, you'll notice that indeed it's emulating the model. So that's what's happening now. The other thing I'm going to look at now is inside the DBCZ log info, which shows you how many virtual log files we created. In this case, we've got 3, and that's fine. So now we're going to create a database with setting the log file. In this case, you'll notice the initial size of the database file is jumped from 3 megabytes to 1,000 megabytes. I've also increased the file growth of the data file. And more importantly, I've looked at the file growth. The size of the log file is 100 megabytes. And I've also said grow, if you need to expand the database, grow it by 100 megabytes. So I've pre-sized the log file so that auto increment does not activate. And we'll look into that right now. So if I highlight it and execute, just takes a second, obviously, because it's a little larger database. But it won't take that long to create it. And so once we've created it, what we can do is to do a comparison. So now if you go to Database, refresh, and now I'm going to look inside the properties of Auto2 database. Go to Properties, go to Files, and you'll see that initially I've changed the size from 3 to 1,000, and then the log files from 1 to 100. More importantly, I've changed the auto growth properties. I've said the auto growth, and you can click on this to see it. I've said that when the auto growth property, when the data files grow, if it needs to activate the auto growth, then it does it by 100 megabytes at a time rather than percentage. I don't like to use percentage because I want to be consistent. So it's highly recommended that you set the file growth for both the data files and log files in megabytes rather than a percentage. So I've changed that property, enable auto growth, to 100 megabytes. And here you'll notice here I've said the maximum size is 100 right here, so unlimited. If I look at the transactional log, same capability. I've said that if the transactional log needs to increase, then increase it in increments of 100 megabytes rather than in a percentage, and it's unlimited. So now the question is, I've got 2 databases, one with the default settings, one with the settings that I've initiated. So what I'm going to do now is just look at the databases. I can only do it one at a time. So again, this is just a quick examination of the files. So notice, oops, right here, 3 megabytes in size, 1 megabyte, and then the growth rate is 1 megabyte and 10%. For the second database that we pre-allocated, you'll see that we've initially increased the size. And not only that, we've also changed the growth pattern, which is the auto growth. We've said that grow that in 100 megabytes. And now if we look at the log space used by both databases, let me scroll up here. You'll notice here that the initial log file is basically 1 megabyte and 36% of it is utilized. And then the Auto2 database, We increased the log file to 100 megabytes, and it's virtually non-existent in terms of log space. So now that we have a comparison, let's start inserting data. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move data using the select all into command into the log growth table from this database. Well, actually, I don't think I created a database, so we can use a wizard. So let me do the following. Go to your AdventureWorks 2012 database, go right click, go tasks, export data. And this is a quick way, which I'll show you later in the next coming videos. This is the source, so select AdventureWorks, go next. This is the destination, so go put a period. That automatically says local. And now we want to choose the database. Obviously, I want to go into auto, go next, go next. And the one I want to choose actually that has a lot of data is sales order detail. And then just go next. Basically, it's taking data from the AdventureWorks database and populating here. As soon as I finish that, we'll have about 120,000 rows. Very quickly done. Don't worry about the import-export wizard. That's another class. So as you can see, over 121,000 imported. That's great. I'm going to do the same thing now and import it into this database. So I'm going to do exactly the same thing. Go to tasks, export, next, next, put a dot for local. This time I'm going to choose auto 2. Next, next. Again, I'm going to select the table, sales order detail. Go next. I'm just going to finish, and quickly we're going to transfer the data. So now we have two databases populated with data. So the whole idea is that initially I created a database and I used the default settings for the auto growth. In the second databases, I physically manually adjusted the auto growth settings a little higher than the default. And the whole purpose is that when the database is being modified in some way, the transactional log is recording that, as we've already stated in the previous videos. And any modifications to the database is recorded in the transactional log. As such, when an auto growth occurs only when there's insufficient space in the transactional log file. And if there isn't space, it will expand. If there is space, it will not expand. So that's the demonstration we're going to give. And we can actually now look inside that, for example. So what is the result? And let's look at the notes that I've got. As the insert is being recorded in this transactional log, that was 1 megabyte in size. The initial size, 1 megabyte of the transactional log recording can't keep up with the activity, and as such needs to expand by 10% each time there is a modification to record. And now you can look into the query, and I'll be giving you this, so highlight this and execute. And as soon as you execute this, you can actually look inside the databases that are auto-growing, both in terms of the data files and then the auto-grow. Now you're not seeing this is the incremental change as the inserts being recorded to the initial database that was not pre-sized. The auto growth kicked in 1 megabyte at a time. This is the default setting, as you can see. And there's the log increasing. There's the data increasing. And as you can see, there's many auto increments. We can look at that also. But one thing you'll notice is that I don't have anything for auto 2. And that's because the auto growth did not expand because it was already pre-sized. Another way of looking at that is go right click, go reports, standard, disk usage. And this is a great reporting tool also. So you'll notice here that if you expand this, click on the thing, you'll get the same result set that we just got from the script. And this is clearly illustrating that the auto growth increment is increasing 1 megabyte at a time, which is the default. And this is one thing we want to avoid. This causes fragmentation. If I do the same, go to right click auto 2, go to reports, standard reports, disk usage. You'll notice that because I pre-sized, I don't have auto growth increments. And that's the whole idea of increasing the size and pre-sizing it to avoid auto growth increments. And that saves a tremendous amount of performance issues. So in the next video, I'm going to be talking about the virtual log files, which are basically units, if you will, of the transactional log. And anytime you create a transactional log, we must size it properly initially to avoid greater virtual log files. And I'll be demonstrating that also. So this video, just to wrap it up, illustrates that when you have not pre-sized the auto growth settings, and there's a transaction that needs extra space, the transactional log will constantly expand by the determined model size, and that causes fragmentation, internal fragmentation, and we want to avoid that at all costs. And we've shown you how to do it and demonstrated that. So I'm going to leave it right now and pick it up next time, and we're going to look at virtual log files, the anatomy of the transactional log file, and then we'll conclude by creating a database. And my name is Rafael, and this is how to become a production SQL database administrator. See you in the next video.